Have you ever struggled with cutting knit fabrics? Perhaps you find it hard to find the grain line, getting things like stripes and patterns to align, and sometimes even ended up with twisted garment because it was so hard to cut straight with all this soft, stretchy fabric being quite unruly. Yes, knit fabrics and cutting them are definitely different compared to woven fabrics. So there are some different methods that you need to utilize to actually be successful with cutting knits. And in this video, I will share those exact steps that you need to take to make cutting knits so much easier. So let's start with tip number 1. Now this principle applies to all fabrics, but it's absolutely crucial when cutting knits because knits are stretchy and that means that will become distorted and stretched out when weighed down. So what to do if your cutting table is too small to fit the entire fabric piece? Well, what you do is you simply roll up the surplus fabric, let it sit on the table until you need it, and then roll it out again. Remember to never let the fabric hang off the table. You should also try to cut from the right side if the fabric has a right and the wrong side. And examples of fabric that has a right and the wrong side are single jerseys, sweatshirt knits, French terry, printed knits, stretch velour and most texture knits. And why, you may ask? Well, if the knit has a right and a wrong side, it's usually better to cut the piece with the right side facing up because you need to align the grain line with the rib, the weft or any type of vertical formation, and doing this will be much easier if you have the right side facing up towards you. Now some fabrics doesn't have a right and a wrong side. For instance, if you're using double knits, interlock fabrics and rib knits, another type of fabric that looks the same on both sides, you can of course ignore this advice because both fabrics are the right side, so to speak. So how do you figure out the right side? Well, on fabrics with a wrong and a right side, there's a subtle difference that will be clear if you have good lighting or even better, perhaps a magnifying sewing lamp. For instance, jersey knits and similar fabrics will have a visible weft running lengthwise on the right side. Think of it like a narrow rib formation to get an idea. And on the wrong side, there's no visible rib. Instead, the fabric looks kind of flat with no discernible pattern or surface. That means it's the wrong side. And technically speaking, on single jersey fabrics, the wrong side is a purl stitch and the right side is a knit stitch, just like you would say with hand knitting. And here's a super tip for you. Use freezer tape to label the right side of the fabric. Just write the info down on the tape, for instance, R, that stands for right side, place it on the pieces as soon as you're done cutting. When cutting knit fabrics, you should follow the rib and not the selvedge. And I put that in quotation marks because there is no selvedge on knit fabrics. And because there is no selvedge on knits, you should not assume that the fabric has been cut straight, which means that you shouldn't measure the grain line from the fabric edge when cutting knits. So instead, you need to find the vertical formation as I mentioned before, such as the weft or the rib on the fabric, and then you align the grain line on your sewing pattern with that line instead. And here's a super easy trick to align the grain line. If you're cutting pieces that don't have straight edges, such as sleeves, it can actually be tricky to align the pattern grain line with the vertical wefts on the fabric, but here is a simple trick to try. You fold the pattern along the grain line, then you align the folded edge along the vertical formation on the knit fabric, and once you align that, you just finish by opening up the pattern again, lying it flat on the fabric. You have a perfectly aligned pattern piece, just folding along the grain line arrow over your pattern. Try cutting knits as a single layer. If you're cutting striped, pattern or very soft, supple knits that are hard to work with, cutting the pieces one at a time using a single layer of fabric is usually much more accurate. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that you have to mirror duplicate pieces, such as the sleeves, because otherwise you will end up with two left sleeves if the fabric has a wrong and a right side. And if you want to learn more about how to cut striped knit fabrics in particular, I recommend you check out the blog post I've done about this topic, and you will find it as a link in the description section of this video. I recommend you use pattern weights when cutting knits or pin sparingly, because using pins can damage delicate knits. That is why I recommend using pattern weights to keep the pattern pieces in place during cutting. And if you are using pins, pin them sparingly and close to the edges. And if you need more stability, I recommend that you just place heavy objects in the middle of the pattern to keep it flat, because those will be the most visible in the garment and you don't want to push pins through that piece of the fabric. So let's talk about tools for cutting. Either use a rotary cutter and a cutting mat, or a pair of very sharp scissors to cut knits, because this will make cutting knits much easier and faster, and the edges will look cleaner too. Trying to cut knits with a dull pair of scissors is not a good idea. Personally, always use a rotary cutter and a mat, but I also recommend the Kai scissors. They're really good. They're one of the few scissor brands that are actually able to cut really sharply in knit fabric. So that's another option to try. Now, speaking of scissors, what I do when I'm marking notches is that I cut tiny notches and clip them into the seam allowance instead of using, say, tailor's chalk and similar marking tools. Why, you may ask? Well, those type of tracing tools, they doesn't always stick to knit fabrics, especially ones that has slippery surface. So what you should do is cut those tiny notches. They should be no more than 2 to 3 millimeters long, which is about 1/8 of an inch. If the knit fabric you're using is prone to unraveling, such as sweater knits, there are better methods than cutting notches. You could try and use chalk, pins, or maybe you could even try taping the fabric to match the notches. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you want to learn more about how to cut and sew knits, I highly recommend that you go over to my website thelaststitch.com, where I have tons of tutorials on how to work with knit fabrics. Stitch safe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!